All right, so this tree guide looks at Al-Qaeda leadership and the evolution of their ideology. So we first start out with Al-Banna as well as Mr. Saeed Qutb. These two individuals who are the founding members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Keep in mind there is a debate about whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood is a political advocacy group. Are they a terrorist organization? So I guess this is going to be conditional based on who you ask. What I want you to recognize here is that this group is working primarily in Egypt, and then from there, their interpretation of Islam as well as their ideological, thought process gets exported to other places. And so you see some of their leadership working in schools and influencing other individuals that would later create organizations like Al Qaeda and other organizations like the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and so on. Anyway, so we're going to first start off with these two individuals, and then we kind of start moving down. Keep in mind the two tracks: Muslim Brotherhood influences as well as the Soviet Afghan War. So these two things are crucial to understand the evolution of Al Qaeda's ideology and interpretation of Islam. So we're going to now look at Al Zahari. So this individual is a member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is current leader of Al Qaeda. And this screencast was created January 21, 2021. Take a look at that. Anyway, so he's the guy in charge. So the story is that this individual has the soldiers, and he's the one who provides the soldiers, whereas bin Laden provides the money. And notice here I put viewed as a leader and financier of global terrorism. So these two individuals are eventually going to find each other, and where? In the Soviet Afghan War under the tutelage of this individual, Abdullah Azzam. Anyway, let's take a look at Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the guy who planned the 9/11 attacks. So looking at his bio, um, this individual joins the Muslim Brotherhood at 16. Here's a speech regarding the Soviet Afghan War. This individual lived in the United States as a student and was harassed. This is an interesting story because very similar to Saeed Qutb, both of these individuals found themselves in the United States. And they tell similar stories about their views on things like civil rights, the treatment of African Americans, as well as the sexual revolution. And they both were the butt of jokes as they were in the United States. Um, in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's story, stories are told about him praying and his shoes being stolen and thrown into a lake. So for the most part, both of those individuals, when you look at their bio, they seem to have been bullied on some level. Whether or not that created a sense of hatred for Americans, I don't know, but I can't imagine that helped. Next individual we're looking at is Dr. Fatal. This individual fled to Egypt with Al-Zahari. So these two individuals have something in common, and their goal here was to rebuild. And notice how we're looking after the assassination of Sadat. So that is taking place in Egypt. And what they are trying to do here is they are trying to make Egypt, at this particular point, some sort of Islamic state. The problem is Sadat represents the government, and this individual seems to be more supportive of the West. And later on, we would see support of Egypt for Israel through treaties that would eventually be signed, which angers some of the individuals that are on this particular sheet here. Let's take a look at al-Suri. So al-Suri, his contribution, he writes the piece Global Islamic Resistance Call. And in that, he argues for the use of small global cells. So we'll be looking at this individual. So for the most part, he provides the military blueprint. This individual is going to provide the soldiers. This individual is going to provide the money. And this guy, Abdullah Azzam, is going to provide a belief in cause that they can actually do, wage war against global powers like the Soviet Union and the United States, where he would be viewed as a hero. In fact, anybody participating in the Soviet Afghan War would probably get that hero type role. All right, let's take a look at here. The Blind Sheikh, leader of Islamic group in Egypt. Um, and so this individual is also connected to this organization over here. And he was also connected to the 93 Trade Center bombing. Ramsay Youssef would, reference part of his motivation as a result of what's happening to the Blind Sheikh here. So they have a connection. Speaking of Ramsay Youssef, this guy is related to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. This is the guy who plans the 93 Trade Center bombing. At that point, Al-Qaeda is pretty much an idea. Let's see. So everybody in blue that I circled are Al-Qaeda's founding members. So all of the circled people are Al-Qaeda's founding members. If you see a reference to SAW, that is the Spanish-American War. And MB is a reference to the Muslim Brotherhood. So let's take a look at this guy, Abdullah Azzam. This individual fought in the Soviet Afghan War. He wrote a piece called Defense of Muslim Lands. And in this particular piece, he argued that it was crucial to go on a offensive jihad, that Muslims were under attack. If you don't remember, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Many civilians were killed, and Abdullah Azzam led his people through an organization that raised funds called MAK. Abdullah Azzam would also claim in his piece, Defense of Muslim Lands, that if you were not fighting his jihad against the Soviet Union, then he was not going to consider yourself a Muslim. This had to resonate in the minds of many of the people on this particular sheet, because bin Laden would be one of those individuals who would leave Saudi Arabia to go to Afghanistan to help. Also keep in mind, he would find himself in Afghanistan, would also go to Afghanistan, and would also travel to Afghanistan. And so would this guy, Haider Zamar. So all of them have that particular item in common. One point about Saeed Qutb, he's the individual in Milestones who wrote about purification of his religion, and argued, similar to other individuals, that you can kill and find a loophole around the Quran that talks about life being sacred, and using the argument that if you're fighting a war, that it would be okay to strike. And that would basically mean that Muslims would be eligible to be killed, as well as anybody, oppressing Muslims. And his view is very simple. He just looks at the idea of anything that is going to potentially corrupt the religion would be problematic. So if we take this line here representing a Muslim and their path of religion, anything can corrupt that particular path. Let's say watching too much TV that stands in the way of one praying. Let's talk about, eating pork. That could be an issue, or, not following the fast because you're too hungry and maybe you're tempted by a McDonald's commercial. Who knows? Pornography, all of these things would get the Muslim off of that particular path. And any of these examples that I use, these Western influences, they seem to be corrupting the pure glass of water and tainting it. And so that's this individual's argument. I usually refer to him as a glass of water guy in class, but his ideas about fighting back, when to fight back, and the purification of religion definitely influence Abdullah Azzam, as well as some of these other individuals that have been mentioned here. So in the Soviet Afghan War, we also can talk about this guy, Haider Zamar, was an Al-Qaeda recruiter. This individual was in Germany, at Hamburg, Germany, and he was a member of the Al-Quds Mosque. So he's at the Al-Quds Mosque, and he's viewed as a leader because he had fought in the Soviet Afghan War. This individual fights in the Soviet Afghan War. This guy's there. This individual's there. So basically anybody in the Soviet Afghan War is considered a hero. And so Haider Zamar is preaching this interpretation of Islam that is looking at the end of the Soviet Afghan War in the early 90s and arguing that the West is being a problematic, stepping in the path of those individuals that want to create some sort of Islamic state. And they would feel that anybody working for the government that is advocating for Western ways in a state that has a high Muslim population, that those individuals would also be problematic, which is part of the reason, again, why Sadat's assassinated, for that particular issue, as well as the stance on Israel. And you start to see the origins of the ideology. For example, Ramsay Youssef. If we take a look at Ramsay Youssef for his 93 Trade Center bombing, he was definitely critical of the U.S. policy with Israel. And he completes his bombing attack in 93, and then bin Laden in 98 would write his fatwa that would pretty much outline a lot of the ideas that are mentioned here. Some of the ideas that are talked about in Said Qutb's piece, and then revival of Abdullah Azam's piece with an addition that pretty much says we're going to take what was initially for Afghanistan and we're going to apply this on a global level. So let's go back here to Haider Zamar. So Abdullah Azam is going to be his mentor. Said Qutb will be Abdullah Azam's mentor. And then Haider Zamar and bin Laden would then later go on to influence these individuals who are the 9/11 hijackers. These three are members of the Hamburg cell. We have Mohammed Atta, Zaid Jarrah, Al-Shihi, and Al-Shib. Al-Shib was supposed to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, but he was not allowed to get into the United States. And that'll take us up to 2001, the 9/11 attacks. Where does al-Zahari come into play? Well, al-Zahari was the leader of a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he initially is fighting after the United States gets involved in Iraq after the 9/11 attacks, and his organization, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, he definitely seemed to have tension with Osama bin Laden. I don't think these individuals worked together. That seemed to be an issue of concern with tension between the two of those individuals. And eventually he's killed in a drone strike, a bombing campaign of the United States. And the new leadership would be Al-Baghdadi, who would take Al-Qaeda in Iraq and create a new group called ISIS, which is trying to create an Islamic State, which, if you haven't figured out, is the same idea that they're pretty much arguing here and arguing here.